There are things you cannot unknow once you know them. The moment my sister slid that envelope across the restaurant table with a smile she had clearly rehearsed, something inside me went completely still, not angry, not devastated, just still. In the way a person goes still when they realize that the story they have been telling themselves about their family was never actually true. I did not make a scene. I did not raise my voice, or knock over a glass, or storm out dramatically the way a lesser version of me might have wanted to. I simply paid the bill, buttoned my coat, and walked out into the bitter Chicago night with a calm that surprised even me. What happened over the following weeks was not something I planned with malice. It was something that happened because the truth, once it starts moving, does not stop for anyone, not even a bride standing at an altar she cannot afford in front of a crowd she invited to watch her shine. My name is Delia Ashworth, and I am 34 years old. Most people who know me casually would describe me as quiet, maybe a little reserved. The kind of woman who shows up to family dinners, smiles appropriately, asks questions about other people's lives, and volunteers almost nothing about her own. That discretion was never accidental. I built my career in private equity the same way I built everything else in my life, methodically, patiently, and entirely out of sight. What started as a solo financial consulting practice run from a spare bedroom had grown, over the course of a decade, into a firm managing portfolios well into the tens of millions. Nobody in my immediate family knew the full shape of what I had built. I had made that choice deliberately, because I understood, from a very young age, that information in my family was never just information, it was currency, and it was always spent against you. My parents, Claudette and Bernard, had raised us in the affluent northern suburbs of Chicago, in a house full of beautiful things and very little warmth. My father ran a logistics company, and spoke about money the way some people speak about morality, as though it were the only reliable measure of a person's worth. My mother was his social strategist, managing their reputation and their relationships with the kind of focused precision that left almost no room for anything resembling real connection. Growing up in that environment, you either learned to perform, or you learned to disappear. I disappeared. I turned inward, redirected my energy toward building something real, and gradually stopped needing their approval so completely that by the time I reached my early 30s, the absence of it barely registered. My younger sister Vanessa was 28 and had always occupied the role of family centerpiece. She was striking, socially fluent, and had spent her entire life absorbing the language our parents spoke, the one that valued presentation above everything else. I did not resent her when we were children. I simply stopped expecting to be included in whatever version of the family portrait she was always at the center of. By the time she called me one October afternoon to invite me to a dinner celebrating her engagement, I had been existing on the margins of this family for so long that the invitation itself felt slightly out of character. I went anyway, because refusing felt like more energy than attending, and because some quiet, still hopeful corner of me wondered if something had changed. The dinner was held at a downtown steakhouse my parents had always used for occasions they wanted to feel significant. The restaurant was beautiful, the wine was expensive, and the conversation was entirely about Vanessa from the moment we sat down. She was engaged to a man named Preston, whose family she described as old European money, with connections that stretched from private banking in Geneva to a coastal estate in California. Preston himself was handsome in a way that felt deliberately assembled, with a watch that probably cost more than most cars, and a handshake designed to communicate authority. The evening moved through appetizers and entrees and a great deal of discussion about the destination wedding being planned for a private resort on the Pacific coast. I smiled, asked questions, and watched the table carefully. By the time the dessert plates were removed, something about the whole performance felt slightly too polished, like a room staged for a photograph rather than lived in. Then Vanessa reached into her purse and slid an envelope across the tablecloth toward me. I picked it up expecting an invitation. What I found instead was an itemized bill for my portion of the dinner, and a single typed letter informing me, in formal language, that I would not be attending the wedding. She did not wait for me to finish reading before she began explaining herself, and she did not bother lowering her voice. Preston's family moves in a very specific world, she said. These are people with gallery collections, private memberships, generational relationships with institutions you have probably never encountered. You freelance from your apartment. You show up to things in whatever you happen to find that morning. What exactly are you going to contribute to a room like that? My mother sighed and reached across to pat my hand with the gentle condescension of someone who had known this conversation was coming and had decided in advance that sympathy was more elegant than honesty. My father swirled his wine and said nothing at all, which told me everything I needed to know about who had helped design this particular evening. The bill came to $138. I reached into my bag, moved past my everyday wallet without a second glance, and placed my matte black private banking card on the edge of the table, with a quiet, deliberate sound. Vanessa looked at it the way people look at something they want to dismiss, but find themselves unable to entirely ignore. She told me I did not need to perform for the table. I said nothing. I handed the card to the server, watched the transaction complete without a single hesitation, stood up, told Vanessa I hoped the wedding was everything she imagined it would be, and walked out into the cold without once looking back. What none of them had ever taken the trouble to discover was that the woman they considered too unremarkable for a guest list had quietly become the kind of person who owned things they had spent their entire lives trying to appear adjacent to. 2 years before that dinner, my parents had arrived at the end of a long cycle of financial overextension they had managed to hide from almost everyone, including themselves. My father had exhausted credit lines, concealed significant debt from my mother, and eventually defaulted on their lake house in Newport, a property that had served as the crown jewel of their social identity for more than a decade. When the bank moved toward foreclosure, the listing crossed my desk through a distressed asset channel my firm monitored regularly. I recognized the address the moment I saw it. My holding company acquired the debt quietly, approached my father through a third-party intermediary, and offered him a deed transfer in exchange for full debt forgiveness and a subsidized 2-year lease that would allow my parents to remain in the home without interruption. My father signed without informing my mother of the full terms. He told her it was a refinancing arrangement with favorable conditions. He never mentioned that the person who now legally owned their lake house was the daughter he had just helped uninvite from a family wedding. The morning after the dinner, I called my wealth manager, a sharp and thoroughly unflappable man named Nathaniel, and gave him 2 instructions. The first was to immediately lock the Newport property title and flag any financing attempts made against it. The second was to run a comprehensive background check on Preston and the family whose name Vanessa had been trading on in every conversation for the past 6 months. Something had been bothering me since the moment I sat down at that restaurant. Something about a supposedly wealthy family that appeared to expect the bride's parents to carry every single financial burden of an elaborate destination wedding. By the following afternoon, the early findings were not just interesting, they were remarkable. Preston appeared as an authorized signatory on a shell company currently under active federal scrutiny for concealing corporate debt. The family estate, the European connections, the coastal property he had referenced repeatedly in social conversations, all of it was either leased, fabricated, or pulled wholesale from stock imagery. There was no trust fund. There was no old money. There was a man drowning under private creditors who had identified Vanessa as a possible route to a property he believed she stood to inherit. 3 days after the dinner, my building security flagged an unauthorized access attempt at my penthouse. I pulled up the live camera feed on my phone and watched my mother and Vanessa move through my home office with the practiced efficiency of people who had discussed the plan beforehand. They were pulling drawers, checking behind frames, running their fingers along shelving in the methodical pattern of someone who had been told exactly what to look for. When they found the wall safe behind a framed print and began trying combinations, I activated the building intercom. My voice came through the room speaker at normal conversational volume. I told them that 3 more incorrect attempts would trigger an automatic police dispatch for a reported burglary in progress. My mother stammered something about the family diamond tiara that Vanessa needed for bridal portraits, then added, with a cruelty so fluent it barely sounded intentional, that it hardly mattered to me personally, since I would never have any occasion to wear it. I told her calmly that the safe had been empty for over a year, and that the tiara was secured in a bank vault across the city. Then I activated the full building lockdown. Every door in the penthouse sealed in sequence. I told them they had 3 minutes to restore my office to its exact original condition before I released the locks, or the police would arrive and write the rest of the story for all of us. I watched from my remote feed, a cup of espresso in one hand, as my mother and sister dropped to their knees and rebuilt my filing stacks with hands that were visibly shaking. When the timer ended, I released the locks. They left without saying another word. Within 2 days, Vanessa had reframed the entire incident as a live social media broadcast, filmed from the sidewalk outside my building. She told thousands of followers that her unstable, envious older sister had locked her and their mother inside an apartment, without cause or warning. She left out the safe. She left out the 3 minutes on the floor. What she did not leave out, because she did not realize it was visible in the frame, was a wedding planning binder she held up during a second live video. One careless turn of the cover flashed a funding schedule page showing a $50,000 bridge transfer labeled under something called the Calder Family Trust. I paused the frame and sent it directly to Nathaniel. The routing number traced back to the same shell company already under federal review. Preston was the listed signatory. The trust did not exist. The wedding was being assembled on the financial equivalent of a foundation that was already crumbling from below. My portfolio included a cliffside coastal estate in a private resort community that I controlled as majority owner through a chain of holding companies. It was, as I confirmed when I cross-referenced Vanessa's wedding booking documents, the exact property she had selected for her destination ceremony. I arrived 4 days before the wedding, settled into the owner-reserved penthouse suite accessible only through a biometric elevator, and spent my first evening on the terrace watching the event staff arrange floral installations across the grounds below, with the unhurried precision of people paid to make things look effortless. That quiet lasted until my phone buzzed with a message from Preston, who had somehow obtained my number and opened with what he presented as a sincere apology for the dinner. The conversation shifted within 4 exchanges. He needed $50,000 immediately to cover a vendor balance due the following morning, and he promised repayment from a trust disbursement he claimed was already processing. I let him talk. I let him build the story, and then watch it fall apart under its own weight, until he admitted, in complete and specific detail, that his family's wealth had collapsed a decade earlier, that he was being pursued by private creditors who were running out of patience, and that he had pursued the engagement because he believed Vanessa stood to inherit the Newport property, and he intended to force its sale within months of the ceremony. My terrace recording system captured every word of it. When my family arrived at the resort the next morning, Vanessa requested a suite upgrade, escalated immediately to demanding the penthouse. And when the general manager, a composed professional named Winston, explained that the penthouse was owner-occupied, she bypassed the lobby entirely and rode a service elevator to my floor with my mother right behind her. I told building security to let them through. They walked into my living room already mid-sentence, and stopped completely when they found me standing by the window in a silk robe with a sparkling water, looking entirely unsurprised to see them. Vanessa accused me of following her across the country. My mother called it a desperate obsession. I said nothing in response to either of them. I placed a single document on the coffee table between us, a behavioral agreement stating that any further disruption of resort operations would result in immediate cancellation of all wedding arrangements and full forfeiture of every deposit paid to date. My head of security, a calm and very large man named Grant, stood behind me without a word while both of them read it, processed it, and signed it with hands that were not entirely steady. They were escorted to the elevator without further conversation. That evening, Preston bribed his way past the lobby and requested access to my floor a second time. My team brought him up. He arrived on the terrace, looking hollowed out, and confessed everything again, point by point, including the creditors, the fabricated wealth, the calculated engagement, and his plan to liquidate the Newport property before the first anniversary of the marriage. He thanked me when he left, genuinely believing he had secured the wire transfer, and that morning would bring relief. He had no idea he had delivered an identical recorded confession for the second time in under 48 hours. The wedding morning arrived in absurdly beautiful light, golden and clear across the Pacific, in a way that felt almost like the weather was in on the joke. From my terrace I watched Vanessa direct the floral arrangements with the focused intensity of someone who believed that if the flowers were perfect, everything else would hold. The collapse began early in the afternoon, when the head caterer approached my parents to inform them that Vanessa's cashier's check had been returned, and that $40,000 was needed immediately, or all food and beverage service would be pulled before the first course. My father laughed it off, called it a clerical error, and attempted 4 separate cards in front of the caterer, and a growing circle of witnesses. All 4 declined. He turned to Preston. Preston's card failed. The champagne carts were wheeled away from the reception space before the ceremony had concluded. and the sound of guests murmuring to each other drifted all the way up to where I was standing. At the altar, Preston stood rigid and gray-faced, knowing the shape of what was already unraveling. Vanessa walked down the aisle on my father's arm, with her jaw set in barely controlled fury. The moment they reached the officiant, she leaned toward the live microphone and demanded to know what Preston had done with the vendor accounts. He responded by stating that her father's cards had all failed and that his own access was frozen. The argument escalated in front of 300 guests and the professional live streaming crew Vanessa had hired to broadcast her perfect day to her audience. She accused him of manufacturing an entire identity. He shouted that the ring was bought on the last credit line he could access, that the trust was fictional, that the engagement had been a strategy built around a lake house she was never actually going to inherit. Vanessa screamed that he was lying and threw her bouquet directly into his face. He struck her across the cheek. The sound passed through the officiant's microphone and out across the speakers, captured simultaneously by the live stream camera and the phones of dozens of guests who were already recording. Security had Preston off the property within minutes, but the footage was already moving through the internet faster than anyone could think to stop it. Winston brought all 4 of them to the estate management office. I walked in while my father was still demanding that someone locate the actual property owner and hold them accountable for the disaster unfolding on their grounds. I sat down behind the desk and let the silence build until it had weight. When my father told me to stand up and wait outside, Winston quietly informed him that he was already looking at the owner. I placed 3 items on the desk in front of them. The recorded deed showing I had held legal ownership of the Newport Lake House for 2 full years. My father's financial disclosures confirming his accounts had been in default and overdraft for months, and the security recordings of Preston, in his own voice, cataloging his debts, his fabricated background, his contempt for Vanessa, and his explicit plan to strip the property the moment a marriage license made it possible. Vanessa sat completely still and listened to the recorded voice of the man she had uninvited her sister to marry, as it took apart everything she had believed her life was becoming. I called Winston back in, had Preston arrested for assault committed on managed property, and had formal 30-day eviction notices delivered to my parents for a house that had not belonged to them for 2 years. They were escorted off the resort grounds, while Vanessa's own live stream continued running in the background, broadcasting the wreckage of the perfect day she had built her audience to witness. I rode the elevator back to my penthouse, poured a glass of wine, and stood on the terrace watching the light move across the Pacific until the water was dark and still. The quietest kind of power has always been the kind that never once needed to announce itself to be entirely, undeniably real.